Now, yesterday I did a video handling the anthropology of Marxism, and today I'd like to cover the economic half. Really, Marxism is split into two periods. There was the period of young Marx, and then there's the period of who I'd call English Marx. Marx after he'd moved to England and produced most of his work there. And I much prefer the former. Young Marx, he had his philosophical doctorate dissertation. He had his 1844 manuscripts, the letters he wrote to his girlfriend. Those are much more interesting and would be something I'd actually enjoy analyzing one day, but today we'll be going over English Marx, the economic half of English Marx. And the Marxist theory of economy, the late Marxist theory of economy, relies entirely on the theory of value that they hold. It's a derivation of the labor theory of value, which means, as it sounds, to an extent, all valuable commodities derive their value from human labor. Now, virtually every capitalist disagreement comes down to the source of value, the theory of value that they hold, and that it would typically be different from what a Marxist holds. The labor theory of value justifies and is the bedrock for every Marxist theory of economy. So, it's worth going over the LTV, because if it's not applicable, then the entirety of Marxism falls apart. The theory of surplus value falls apart, the theory of the downfall of capitalism falls apart, but we'll get to all of that in a moment. One important thing to note is that Marx thought his labor theory of value was descriptive of value, and that it was a useful, intuitive, descriptive measure of price. That's why it was supposedly useful, but to quote the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy on Marx, they say, "It follows from the analysis so far that labor-intensive industries ought to have had a higher rate of profit than those which use less labor. Not only is this empirically false, it is theoretically unacceptable. Accordingly, Marx argued that in real economic life, prices vary in a systematic way from values. Providing the mathematics to explain this is known as the transformation problem, and Marx's own attempt suffers from technical difficulties. Although there are known techniques for solving this problem now, albeit with unwelcome side consequences, we should recall that the labor theory of value was initially motivated as an intuitively plausible theory of price. But when the connection between price and value is rendered as indirect as it is in the final theory, the intuitive motivation of the theory drains away. And that is to say that Marx's theory at this point is no longer descriptive, it becomes prescriptive. He is redefining value to fit his theory, rather than making a theory that fits the real definition of value as people hold it, that is, price to an extent, or at least something correlative with price. And that's an interesting section on its own, but going past this, going to something more significant, Marx did believe that this theory of value would predict the downfall of capitalism. This nature of value would predict the downfall of capitalism, and to understand why, think of it like this. Marx believes in something called the theory of surplus value. Marx believes that, essentially, there are two sorts of commodities. There's two sorts of capital, rather, that are used in making other commodities. And the one source of capital is constant capital. Constant capital is capital that you buy for the value that it holds. If you buy, $10 worth of lead, you will get $10 worth of commodities out of that. However, there is also variable capital in his view, and this is exclusively human labor for Marx. Variable capital is capital that you buy for a rate different than its worth. That is to say, you could buy labor for something less than it's actually worth, and this is his whole theory of surplus value, that capitalists buy the labor power of a worker for a day, or however long, and in doing so pay less than their labor is worth. They get surplus value out of that by paying them only the very minimum that they will accept, and thereby getting more value out of their labor than was paid for. This is how these firms turn a profit in the Marxist worldview. However, to quote the Stanford Encyclopedia page again, they say, "It appears to follow from this analysis that as industry becomes more mechanized, using more constant capital and less variable capital, that is, using less labor, the rate of profit ought to fall, for as a proportion, less capital will be advanced on labor, and only labor can create value in the Marxist worldview." In Capital Volume 3, Marx does indeed make the prediction that the rate of profit will fall over time, and that this is one of the factors which leads to the downfall of capitalism. Now, as every single metric would show, this is not the case. Many people did predict this. They predicted that over the course of a few hundred years this would fall, and in the 140 years since Marx's death, it has not fallen. It has only gotten stronger and stronger. And in fact, in those particular circumstances where we analyze either creative destruction or the transformation of a company, those cases where the automation is increased and the human labor is replaced with some sort of automation, some sort of thing that Marx would term constant capital, the firm only ever becomes more valuable. The firm only ever becomes more productive. And this is an interesting circumstance because this case of automation brings us into a much more interesting Heideggerian argument. An argument with an origin in Heidegger's theory of humanity, something more philosophical. To quote Bernard Stiegler, a French Heideggerian philosopher, he says, "Humans would not be human without the technology that threatens to dehumanize them, or give them the power to become superhuman. We are not just the recipients of the gift of Prometheus, namely techne, which is art or craft, but also truly the children who were made by him in his own divine image." Now, what is this to say? It is to say humans are defined inherently by the technology which puts us outside of ourselves. Technology, which is inherently outside of the human condition, is definitive of the human condition. And if you don't believe this, let's move forward to another quote from Jorjani. Jorjani says, "Language and reason are existentially grounded on this being outside and being ahead of humans, so that logos is inextricable from techne. This is true of logos in all of the forms that it takes. The logos qua religion, qua politics, is wholly technical, fruit of an originary incompleteness of technical being." Now, phrased in more simple terms, what that means is that the language, the reason, the social mechanisms that make humans human, the social mechanisms that Marx agrees makes humans human. In fact, in Marx's book on the Jewish question, he phrases humanity as inherently dependent on those communalistic, cultural, social elements, those things that separate us, in his view, from apes. Those are, Marx agrees, what makes humans a unique animal. And they are predicated on the logos, that is in some sense discourse, but in a broader sense all discursive forms of thought, which is itself a technology grounded outside of humans, grounded in the Promethean condition. Promethean, in Greek, comes from a word that means thinking ahead or forethought. And as Jorjani says, language is predicated on that being outside and being ahead. Language is inherently outside of the human. In Chomskyan language and Chomskyan linguistics, this is called E-language and I-language, that is external language and internal language. And both are integral for the acquisition and production of language. They work in a circular, cyclical fashion. And Jorjani is correct in the further inference. Logos is inextricable from techne. That allegorical fire that Prometheus stole from the forge of Hephaestus and gave to humanity is the foundation of the human condition insofar as we are grounded outside of ourselves. And this extends very far. This is a germane quote for reasons that may not be immediately obvious, but in fact, this is similar to what Elon Musk says when he calls a corporation a cybernetic collective. What does that really mean? Well, it means that as humans continue to aggregate in these corporations, the cybernetic begins to overtake the organic until there is an orgiastic end of all distinction between mechanical created things and organic living things. In fact, in Marx's younger writings, in the letters he writes to his girlfriend, and in his philosophical doctorate dissertation, he names Prometheus outright. He, in fact, refers to this Promethean condition in those terms, in the terms of Promethean conditions. However, he never continues this theory into his later philosophical works, and sadly, it's absent. Very unfortunate, because it turns his later works incontrovertibly based on a false dichotomy, the false distinction between labor qua human labor and labor qua inorganic labor. In fact, this separation of the human from themselves, this grounding of the human insistently outside of itself, is a greater form of alienation than Marx ever projected in his writings. To quote Jorjani again, reification and objectification have reached a new level, not just quantitatively, but in terms of a qualitative transformation, which defies the logic of a Marxian analysis. This overwrites Marx's theory about the alienation of labor. Quoting Jorjani again, what Marx has called the alienation of labor has reached a qualitatively different level. Günter Anders points out that even those with expertise in the production of certain designed objects, let alone the mere workers involved in the mechanized production process, do not identify with these products. No one sees these devices as the product of their own labor. The labor and even the creative ingenuity of the human individual seems alienated from the world of machines and products as a whole, to the point where it renders ridiculous the Promethean glory that once hallowed the productive power of mankind, or the creative vision of the genius. That is, we have a sort of Promethean shame, an inherent shame of this overcoming of humanity by being placed outside of humanity, that not only encompasses Marx's theory of alienation of labor, but it overwrites it and it overpowers it with this broader condition stemming back to the originary event of humanity in the originary event of language, the first technology that placed us outside of ourselves, and the technology which allowed humans to become communal and thus become human. Now, this shows something more fundamentally flawed at Marx's analysis of value in labor, and that is that it relies on a false dichotomy between human labor and the labor and effort and change and flux exerted by inorganic, foreseeably inorganic, non-living things. To quote Jorjani again, technologies are developing in ways that will allow a total fusion of man and machine and the abolition of the distinction between what grows organically and what is made mechanically. This end of all things in their alienation from our subjective personhood can be accomplished through an orgiastic fusion of technology with the most primal and primordial aspects of our existence. And what does this mean? We are bridging the gap between the non-living and the living. In Nassim Taleb's book Anti-Fragile, he outlines and identifies one of the foreseeably many properties that separate the non-living from the living, that is anti-fragility, the capacity to respond positively to shocks of a complex system, and shows that this property, which is in no way, no wise reliant on humans, let alone human labor, is something that exists everywhere in nature, something that we bring into being all of the time, and something that foreseeably would push us further towards that bridging of the gap between the organic, living, and mechanistically produced. To quote Bernard Stiegler, technics is the pursuit of life by means other than life itself. And what does that mean? That's another step, another indication of the difficulty, and the certitude with which we will bridge the gap between humanity and the inorganic, non-living things. In fact, the degree to which we've already bridged this gap. We've created large networks which have strongly anti-fragile and emergent properties. We've made programs with built-in emergent properties which simulate many parts of living creatures. We're on the cusp of building strong artificial intelligence which will replace swaths of human activity, and we've already made weak artificial intelligence that replaces things which 50 years ago foreseeably could never be replaced by a machine. Things that foreseeably in Marx's worldview would be inextricably human labor. And this means the distinction between a constant capital and a human labor variable capital is inaccessible to this future, to the post-human future, and is becoming inapplicable today. It has become inapplicable today, and arguably this began in the 20s. Arguably this began with Heidegger's Age of the World picture. However, I won't make that argument right now. Take artificial intelligence as an example of this applied concretely. Self-driving cars, things that would unemploy every taxi driver, every truck driver in America. These are something which very obviously and empirically reduce the amount of what Marx would call variable labor in the workforce, yet foreseeably they could do nothing but increase the profitability of those firms which pick them up. They are, by every Marxist definition, constant capital. However, they, contrary to Marx's analysis, are one of the most profitable foreseeable endeavors that will be undertaken in the next 5 years. And this is very obviously not the only case of this occurring. There's presently in the works in my home state of Vermont a company called Faraday, which is working to replace, at the very least, the function of many, many marketing enterprises in America. Faraday, to their highest exponent, could destabilize and unemploy hundreds or thousands of marketing professionals in America, thereby reducing the amount of variable labor at play in our capitalistic mode of production as it is presently. However, that mode of production would become only more efficient as that variable capital is taken away from it. While this is also, in some sense, predicated on labor, it takes labor to make a company like Faraday, it takes labor to make the algorithm that would cause self-driving cars to become feasible, this is no wise comparable to the amount of variable labor that would be put into the economy otherwise. And Marx theorizes that it is at the very least convex, presumably linear, given the fact that he measures this in hours, in time. It is convex or linear, the amount of variable capital to the profitability of a certain economic system. Now, one could foresee a communist responding to this by saying that this high degree of automation, this high degree of replacement, could be something that replaces capitalism itself, could be the incipient for the communist revolutions and communist shift in the mode of production that Marx predicted and that communists would like to see in the world. However, this is very importantly a jump away from Marx's fundamental worldview. In Marx's worldview, this change, this reduction in the amount of variable capital and increase in the amount of constant capital at play in the mode of production as we have it now, in the economy as we have it now, would decrease the profitability of the system as we have it, and would make it less stable. However, everything we've seen implies it can only be made more stable, and it can only be made more productive and profitable with these sorts of reductions in the human labor usage at play in our market. But it is important to note, this is one of the two strongest rebuttals to Marx's labor theory of value, and to Marx's interpretation of the labor theory of value. Not only is it empirically false from every single metric that's usable, it's not descriptive of value. Marx needed to reconcile his theory for it to be descriptive of value. It does not predict the downfall of capitalism. We have only become more profitable. And in fact, it's reliant on a false dichotomy between human organic labor, living labor, and dead inorganic things causing labor, causing flux, causing a sort of Heraclitean change in our economy. He needs to distinguish those, to have the concept of a variable capital and a constant capital. He needs to have a distinction between the living, human sort of labor and the non-living, inorganic sort of labor. However, as we see through Jorjani, Heidegger, Bernhard Stiegler, and Günther Anders, there is already beginning, and perhaps more completed than not, transition from distinction between the organic and inorganic to an orgiastic fusion of man and machine, man and network. Foreseeably, genetic engineering, robotics, information, and networking would only push this further and further, towards a sort of post-human Promethean future which will embody entirely the Faustian spirit which brought about all of these technologies, and which brought about this philosophical theory. Well, anyway, guys, cheers. That's going to be all for me today. DM me on Urbit. I'm there at Narmalhochtel on the screen right now. Get on Urbit. If you don't want to drop the 20 to get an ID, you can just run a comment. That's free. Check it out. It's cool. Alright. I'm going to make a video on it at some point, as I said in the last video, but for now, 2 Marxism videos in a row. Anthropology, destroyed by Bertrand de Jouvenel. Economics, destroyed by Jason Reza Jorjani. Maybe I should cover young Marx, because he's much, much more interesting. In fact, I'll leave this video off with a little anecdote. The postmodernists, a continental philosophical tradition based on the writings of Heidegger and Nietzsche, the father and grandfather of postmodernism itself, they at one point tried to reconcile Marxism with Heideggerian and Nietzschean thought, and they tried very hard to do this. They got quite close, and I would say they were able to do it. However, they were able to do it only insofar as they gave up Marx's later writings. They could not maintain Capital, they could not maintain the Gotha program, they could not maintain the critique of political economy. Those all had to be given up, but what they kept were his On the Jewish Question, 1844 manuscript, the writings he had to his girlfriend, almost poetic. They were very interestingly written, quite differently from the rest of his stuff. All of the things that Marx wrote while he was really in Germany were much, much more valuable, much, much more interesting. At one point I might want to cover them because they were so significant that that continental philosophical tradition essentially relied on them to reconcile the theories of Marx with the theories of Heidegger and Nietzsche. Anyway, that's where I'm going to end off the video, so cheers, again, Urbit, Narmalhochtel, future of the internet, have a good one.